Hey guys, Jon Stein here from Queen City Clay, and recently after posting some of my Citrus Reamers on my personal social media accounts, a couple people have asked me if I would do a tutorial on how to make them. So they're thrown in one piece. They could be separate, but I prefer to do all the work that I can on the wheel and score as little as possible. So I throw them in one piece with the trapped air form, then this lower kind of pouring bowl section. All right, stick around. We'll walk you through it beginning to end. All right, I've got about 1.5 pounds of clay here, and that's what I used for my reamers. You might decide to use a little bit less or a little bit more, kind of depends on how thick or thin you're gonna throw your walls, and also if you're planning on just juicing limes or you wanna work your way up all the way to a grapefruit. So about 1.5 pounds seems right for me. I'm gonna throw that down and get it centered. And this technique will be familiar for anyone who's ever made a chip and dip or a planter with a tray attached, because it's the same principle where I'm going to use the majority of the clay to make one form and take a small part on the outside here and make something else with it. So first thing I'm going to do is center. Then with my right hand, I'm going to make a fist and I'm going to kick my pinky out a little bit. So that's giving me a little bit of leverage right here to isolate a portion of this clay. So I'm taking that last, not even an inch of width here, and I'm gonna slowly walk it down. And as I do that, if my left hand's not prepared to help catch some of that clay and hold on to it, it's gonna build over and over like a mushroom and eventually fold over. So my left hand's providing just enough resistance to keep this clay centered and attached to the rest of the clay, as I'm gonna continue to walk it down until I feel like I'm somewhere around 3/8 of an inch in thickness from the back. So this is going to be the outside container portion. This inside here is going to be the actual reamer for juicing. So now I'm going to treat this part here like the bat. My left hand's going to rest on it. There's no downward pressure, but it's just sliding. I'm going to put my first and third finger over that middle finger and open, just like we talked about in our opening video. And I'm gonna open all the way down to the bat. Okay, there's gonna be no floor in this center section. I'm gonna continue to open back towards myself and curl under. Now I'm gonna do some pulls. And I'm using a lot of pressure with my right hand in. I wanna get that kind of dome shape started from the very beginning so I don't have as much work to do later. My pinky can't quite fit on this one, and that's okay. Just hanging out on the outside and kind of helping me collar. Gonna do one more little pull. I don't mind leaving these guys a little bit thicker, so that way when they're on the table and you're actually using them, they're less likely to move around. Before I actually collar and close the top, I'm gonna do a rib pass. Clean up the surface. My left hand's gonna press out a tiny bit down here, just to get a little bit of volume. And I won't be able to access this clay quite so well again, so I'm going to also use my rib and compress this lower section. Okay, now that that's all set up to create that dome shape that I'm looking for, I'm gonna come down with wet fingers, reach all the way around, collar and slide up. Okay, so I end up with this kind of wine goblet sort of shape. I'm gonna lose a lot of this clay. This is just sacrificial there to help me bring it in. I could go ahead and pinch the clay all the way in to close the top right now, but the inside's getting a little bit twisted, which is normal. But I'm gonna do one little mini pull, basically just letting my index finger of my left hand rest there to compress that surface and clean it up before I take my fingertips and attempt to close it. So that tore off, didn't completely close, which is completely fine. Now I'm gonna come down a little bit lower, collar in again, and come in until it touches. So I'm almost there. I'll switch to my fingertips to finish the job. Pinch off that tiny little last bit of clay. Now I want to take my rib and compress that opening because it's naturally going to be a weak spot. But the reason I did so much of that shaping early on is so I can protect that shape right now. If you haven't made a trapped air form before, they're a lot of fun. It's a little bit like a water balloon. I can lean with the rib and I'm going to push air somewhere else. And so in order to make sure that I'm ending up the shape that I want, I kind of sketched it in early. Otherwise, as I'm pushing down here, it's going to want to balloon out the lower section, especially if it's thinner. The thinnest area tends to be affected the most. All right, so I'm pretty happy with that shape. I'm thinking about a lime, a lemon, an orange, a grapefruit, some kind of citrus fruit, half of that fruit fitting down over this. I'm smoothing and refining this surface and compressing and closing that top opening. I'm gonna come down here one more time, just to smooth out all of that clay, and I'll use the flat side to get as low as I can for the transition from Reamer to the kind of container portion. So now I need to put in some kind of texture. And if you've seen other folks make these, there's all kinds of options out there, but I like to do as much of the work as I can on the wheel, and I'm not an overly patient person. So what I have found that works for me is using some kind of rib with a curve. So I have this wooden one with me today. I've been using some of the Mud Tool stiffer ribs at home, and just playing with these different curves. But what I'm gonna do is take the point, press down, and roll this rib in to make a dent in the clay, and I'll walk it all the way up to the center. Sometimes I'll bring it back down. So now you can start to see that ridge that's forming. I want to be a little bit methodical with how I'm hitting the clay. So if my hand's the pot, the angle's something like this, and I want to be consistent and make that same kind of curve happen all the way around. I'm going to jump over about 1.5 inches maybe and do the same thing. Jump over another 1.5 inches and do the same thing. So one of the advantages of using a wooden rib is I get a little bit less of the suction kind of sticking happening with the side of the rib. So I have less cleanup to do later. Because it's wood, it's a porous surface, pulls right off. And you can see I'm leaning this entire dome, and that's perfectly fine. Because it's trapped air, I can push on it pretty aggressively and roll all the way in to that tip. I think I can fit in 2 more. The last one here. And I tend to make work in series, so I rarely sit down and make one of a thing. I might be making 5 or 8 of these, and I'll find that, like anything else, I'm usually happiest with some of the later ones after I practice these moves. You can see I am going back and retracing some of the marks I already made, some of the first ones. That's just an attempt to shift it back closer to center. And I'm not worried about it being perfectly centered. You can see there's a little bit of wiggle to it. I will look at which way it's leaning and think about the spout and the handle in relation to that in just a second. But for right now, I need to deal with this area, this section of clay, and creating the container and pouring portion. So to do that, I'm gonna take my fingertip. My fingertip is down on the bat, and my fingernail is in between clay and bat. So just like I'm having someone take my fingerprint. Haven't been in the situation to have my fingerprints taken. Hopefully that remains to be true in the future. I'm gonna slide this underneath, and that naturally starts to shoot up a little bit of a ledge. Now I can come in with just wet fingertips and do a little bit of a pull. I want to leave pretty generous rim so I can play with the spout. And I could get a cutback tool and finish this edge right now, but I'm going to have to deal with the underside of this dome anyway, so I prefer to just trim them, which I'm gonna show you here pretty soon. So at this point, what I'm going to do is to make a spout. So I'm gonna take my thumb and index finger, keep them parallel, and I'm going to have those on the outside of the clay. I'm gonna have a finger on the inside. And the important rules to remember when we're making a spout like this is that all the fingers are parallel. I don't want these to go crooked at all, and that there's a finger width between all of my fingers. Can you see that spacing there? If your fingers end up too tight, you actually weaken the clay before you have a chance to thin it. So I'm going to pull out just a tiny bit, and I'm really gonna press in to define that spout. Okay, and it's not quite finished. It could be, but I like to really exaggerate these spouts. So I'm gonna slide over a little bit so you guys can see what I'm doing. I'm gonna take my thumb and finger, just like this, and I'm going to keep them wet and slide them right through this rim. It's a lot like pulling a handle. I'm trying to do the same exact motion over and over again by keeping my hand in the same place and just bouncing straight up and using the wheel to work my way back and forth, but my left hand's controlling the wheel. I'll lift this up so you guys can have a look. So you can see that edge is much, much thinner, and it's more likely to cut and pour cleanly. Now, I'm gonna take my fingers, and this is a personal preference kind of a thing, and I'm gonna square this off a little bit. I'm gonna lift up with my thumbs. Personally like the look of that. And I'm gonna take a wet finger on the inside of the spout and just wipe it back and forth. No pressure, just making the same path over and over again. Something like that. Okay, so next we're gonna throw a wet chuck, trim, and put a handle on one of these. So let's see what that looks like. I'm a big believer in using a wet chuck. So I'm gonna throw some clay down. Get it centered. Open all the way down to the bat again. And do a couple of pulls. Gonna leave some extra weight in my rim and in the wall. And what I'm looking at is this previously thrown juicer that I made at home yesterday. I'm looking at about this width right here. I want to throw a chuck that's going to hold and fit that width. But before I set it down in there, I need to clean off this clay. So I'm going to reach down and grab my rib. I'm compressing and ribbing the outside, not so much so my piece doesn't stick, but so my trimmings don't stick to it. If I left all that water and slip on there as I'm trimming, they'll fall, they'll get stuck, and it'll make this clay a lot less usable for me in the future. I'm gonna take my rib and slowly roll it over, and I'm using a metal rib, really scraping the heck out of this. I'm getting all of the water and slip that I can off of this surface. So essentially it's gonna be like clay fresh out of the bag, which we use for lugs all the time and our piece doesn't really stick to. And if a tiny bit of clay does stick to the piece, it'll come right off because my piece is leather hard and this clay is soft. You can also take a blowtorch and just touch up this surface. But I wanna see how this fits. Okay, it's a little bit wider than I want. It's actually gonna sit down in this groove, but I'm no longer centered because of how I have created this spout. No longer round rather, not perfectly round. So it's gonna hit this edge. So I need to bring this in a tiny bit. So I'm gonna wet my hands, collar it. Do one more round of ribbing. And this may seem like a lot of work for one pot. And I think that's accurate. But again, I don't usually make one of these at a time. I'm making 5 or 8 or 12. And so I would only have to do this once and then I could trim that entire run of pots. So for me, this sort of prep time, setting everything up, was worth it. Let's see how we're doing now. That's more like it. That's where I want to be. So now I need to get this recentered. So I'm not in bad shape right now, but the most important thing for me right now is that it's level. So people oftentimes take a level and practice. We talked through tap centering in another video. Tap centering can work fairly well with this, but what I find works best is taking your left index finger and pulling out to the left slightly. If we're thinking about the wheel head as a clock face again, I'm at about 8 o'clock pulling out, and my right finger is at about 4 o'clock pushing down. So those two forces counter each other and allow me to find that center point. And it may not look perfectly centered. I didn't do a cutback, so I'm dealing with a little bit of an uneven edge right here to begin with. But that is right where I need it to be. That's nice and level. So now, first thing I'm gonna do is just flatten this surface. I can feel through the wall thickness of what I actually have here, how much extra clay. And I don't have tons, but I wanna get rid of a little bit on the inside here. So I'm gonna trim a little bit of that away. When I'm glazing these, I like to have a glazed interior. So I'm actually going to leave a little bit of an edge here. I think that shadow is coming through on the video. Get the trimmings out of my way. That's gonna help me feel comfortable glazing the inside without that glaze running out. So I'm just gonna take a couple of fingers and roll that in. Now I'm gonna come to this outer edge and touch it just to knock it down and center it. And if you look back at a finished one, you can see that nice little bead on the bottom. I do that on a lot of my work, and it's because I tend to use pretty fluid glazes. So it's not necessary for the function of this piece to have that groove, but it does give me a little bit of wiggle room to play with surfaces and gives me some options. So to put that in, I need to carefully come in just the nose of the tool and trim up towards that bead, but stop before I come all the way through. And then I will very carefully work my way down, trying to avoid that spout. So I can feel that I'm just starting to touch that spout, so that's my cue to stop. And this clay, even though it's leather hard, is still soft enough that with just my fingers, I can roll it over and soften it so it's no longer sharp. While your piece is upside down and in the chuck, you're gonna wanna look at the very, very bottom. So on this piece, you can see it's pretty smooth. You've got all those nice textures and lines on the outside, but the very, very interior is pretty smooth. When you're looking at your piece in the chuck, pull this guy out so you can have a look. It will not be. I don't know how this is coming through, but there's a little bit of a twist down in the very bottom. That's from the closing action, that clay twisting on itself. And if you leave it like that, it's prone to crack. So all I'm going to do is to take a scoring tool and score that 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch in the very, very center. And I generally just take a little bit of clay right from the base of my chuck, like a very little bit. Press it in and smooth it in. So I'm just wiping that clay up into the grooves, smoothing out any marks from my finger, and haven't had one crack yet. Okay, so the next thing we need to talk about is the handle. I'm just gonna use some of this clay, it's already here. This is what I tend to do at home as well. Nothing's wasted. If you don't have a huge studio, you might not have space to store all kinds of chucks for the different size pieces that you make if you do a lot of trimming. So I make them as I need them and then just reuse that clay. So I'm gonna squeeze some of this clay together and we're gonna put a handle on this piece. So I'm gonna add a little bit of water. Even though I threw with this piece already, just squeezing it, my hands work some of that water out and dry it out a little bit. For handles, any kind of small attachments, I want the clay to be fairly soft. So I'm gonna work this back and forth. I'm also trying to kind of hand wedge and get any air bubbles out that might be there. Now I'm going to bounce the clay back and forth. Okay, so I'm not trying to roll a coil, I'm bouncing that clay back and forth. You might have seen a video where Ben or myself has talked about handles previously, but I'm getting this kind of carrot shape. So it's wider at the top and narrows, wider at the top and narrows. And now I'm going to prep it by taking my thumb and fingers and sliding towards the center. It's not a lot of downward pressure, just inward pressure. So I'm not pinching down, I'm just bringing my fingers closer together. and then I will actually pinch that spine. I'm gonna flip it just for symmetry and do it again. All right. So I don't want deep marks on my finger. I want it to be relatively smooth right from the very beginning. And I want a handle for this form that starts out just a little bit longer than my middle finger. That's what works out pretty well for me. And if I'm making a lot of these and I want them to be similar, it's nice to have some unit of measurement in mind, even if it's a finger. So we'll trim off the extra here. I'm going to line up across from my spout so that I'm right in the center. And I'm going to score up this rim. So add a little water and scratch it up. You can use a scoring tool to speed things up a little bit. Just don't happen to have one with me here in our video staged studio. Now I'm going to score my handle. Add a little bit of water and score again. Don't really use slip. I'm gonna score wet score. I'm gonna soften all these edges. And the important thing when attaching a handle is that you don't squeeze and thin out anything. I'm going to have dry skin, dry fingers holding this, and I'm gonna wiggle back and forth and work my way down. So I actually get that clay wrapping over the rim of this Citrus Reamer. Okay, you can see it stands on its own. If you're having any issues, if it's getting too thin right here when you're attaching it because you're squeezing, you might as well start over. You're in trouble right before you start. So right now I'm in pretty good shape. I'm gonna do another round of prepping. That's sliding those thumbs and fingers together. Move over to the side here so you have a little better view. Going nice and slow, overlapping where my fingers have just been, so that way I'm not putting in marks, kind of erasing the mark that I just made as I go. And you can see these fingers stabilizing that handle as I get rid of that spine. Now, it's the first time I add water. I'm gonna flip it up, hold on to it by the dome. I'll take a wet finger and smooth out the attachment point at the top. Wet finger, smooth out the attachment point on the inside. Let's change angles here. There we go. I am going to wet my hand, and I'm going to start out in kind of an okay position. So I've got the webbing in between my thumb and my index finger on one side and my index finger on the other, kind of like that. And I'm going to slide down, just adding some water, but I'll work my way back and forth between the scissors, kind of lengthening, and that okay, controlling the sides and keeping everything nice and smooth. What I'm looking at now is the thickness of the handle to make sure that I'm getting the visual weight in terms of how that compares to the rim, kind of right where I want it. And then I have the length that I need to fold this over. If that doesn't make sense yet, well, in just a second. So you generally get one check, meaning I get one time to kind of flip this around and see what it looks like. And then I can keep working it if I need to. If I do that more than once, it'll start to weaken this section. It'll act a little bit too much like a hinge. So I'm gonna hold on to the tail, flip this around, and bring this up. And I think that's about right where I want it. Okay, so I'm not worried about the shape yet. It's leaning way too far. I'm just worried about the length. I'm gonna line it up to make sure it's straight. Press in with my thumb. I'm gonna work this clay back and forth little by little, just sliding my thumb back and forth until I start to get a pad that I'm happy with. Then I'm gonna take a finger on the inside and lean this whole negative space back in. And if you can see where it starts to thicken up down here, I'll come down, press in just a little bit. I'm looking at this spacing to make sure I still have enough room to get a piece of fruit in. And I want to make sure that I have enough room for a couple of fingers with this handle. there's any kind of cleanup that I need to do on areas like this, now's a good time to do that before I set it aside to let it dry. So this video was a request from a friend of mine on social media after I posted some that I had been making. If there's anything in particular you'd love to hear from me or anyone else at the Queen City Clay staff, please let us know and we'd be happy to shoot another video for you. Hope you guys are staying healthy and making some cocktails. Thanks for watching.